Hello everybody, and welcome to the Module 6 video for Introduction to Logic. This is the module on translation. So this won't be a very long video. I'm just going to run through some of the common English equivalents of our logical operators and do a few examples. I'm going to go through how we translate conjunction, the conditional, alternation, and the biconditional, right? Also, as part of this, the chapter in the book's pretty bare bones. I'm going to post a scan of Chapter 8 of Methods of Logic, the Quine's book, the official textbook that I didn't require you to buy for the class. Even people who don't like that book think that that's a very good chapter, and I agree that it is a very good chapter. So I encourage you all to read it. Just as a heads up about translation, so a lot of logic books and classes spend way more time on this than I'm going to here. There are various reasons for that. I guess the most important reason is that no one really spends that much time sitting around translating this stuff into formal logic and back. So I think it's more important to learn kind of truth value analysis, that kind of thing. So you know logic, and then once you know that, you can figure out how to apply it. It's not so bad. As even Quine in the translation chapter says that what we do when we translate ordinary language into our logical system is we mangle and we butcher it. And so I'm not going to stress this too hard. You won't have anything harder to do on the exams than the homework examples. So let's start with conjunction. Okay. So translating conjunction. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the same sentences for all the examples. And just so I don't have to rewrite them all, I'm going to let P... These are the same examples from the book, by the way. Again, just for simplicity's sake. Doesn't really matter what we choose here, so I'm just going to use the examples from the book because they're right there, and it'll match up if you decide to read the chapter later. So we're going to let P stand for Quine 8a pi. And we're going to let Q stand for, M. We're going to let M stand for Quine drank a milkshake. Right. And so, from the truth table lecture that if we were to write P and M, then that would translate to Quine ate a pie and drank a milkshake, right? And we would represent that with PM like that, right? That's how we do conjunctions. So if you were to have the sentence, Quine ate a pie, but he also ate a milkshake, right? That would also translate to PM. So a lot of people don't recognize that but and mean the same thing, logically speaking, in ordinary language, but they do. So you have to remember that. Just memorize that but is another way of translating conjunction. Right, and then the third common way that we represent a conjunction in ordinary English is with the word although. So if we had Quine ate a pie, although he ate a milkshake, right, that also goes over to PM. Right, and so anytime you see a sentence with any of these three words in it, you have a pretty strong clue that there's a conjunction inside of that sentence. Okay, so let's move on to the ways in which we represent the conditional in ordinary English. Okay, translating the conditional. So we are used to reading schemata like this as if P then M, right? So that's one perfectly acceptable way of saying that in English. So yeah, if Quine ate a pie, then he drank a milkshake, right? There are a few more ways of translating the conditional that are kind of confusing. So if we were to say Quine ate a pie only if he drank a milkshake, right? That also gets translated as if P or P arrow M, right? We can also move the if around, right? So if we wrote M if P, or if we were to say it out, Quine drank a milkshake if he ate a pie, that also, and pay attention to the order here, goes to P arrow M, right? Because up here we have if P then M, right? But if we say Quine drank a milkshake if he ate a pie, right? That switches the order around because the if is the if still before the P here, right? And the part of the conditional that attaches to the if, the antecedent, wait, how do I say this? If is your marker that there's an antecedent going on. So even if we write something like Quine drank a milkshake if he ate a pie, right? We're saying the same thing as if we were to say if Quine ate a pie, then he drank a milkshake. Okay. What's the next one? Another way of representing the conditional in English is provided that. And just like the above one, this switches the order, right? So if we were to write M provided that P, that's the same thing, or we would translate that as P arrow M, right? You just sort of have to memorize these. There's not really a shortcut. And provided that is just a really fancy, like 1950s way of saying if, right? So this and this are pretty much the same thing, right? And then the final way in which you'll run into these in English would be using the expression in case. And here so in case is just another fancy way of saying if, right? So that's going to be all of these three have the order switched, but they're all sort of the same. So if we have M in case P, right, that gets translated the same way, P arrow M, right? And you really just have to memorize these. 90% of the time, I'm not trying to trip you guys up here. So 90% of the time, you're just going to have the default if P then M, the standard, most straightforward way of saying it in English. But do note that these other ones might crop up occasionally, so it's good to know them. Okay. And the conditional is really the only one that's this tricky, where there's many variant expressions and where the order matters. So moving on to alternation. Okay. Translating alternation, this is really easy. There are only two ways that we usually represent alternation in English. Again, P for Quine ate a pie, Q for Quine drank a milkshake. So P or Q, right? And obviously P or Q, right, is the most straightforward way. Another way in which most logic textbooks say that we can translate alternation into and from English is if we have P unless Q, right? So Quine ate a pie unless he drank a milkshake. That's what the book says anyway. I'm actually going to real quick explain why I think that's crap. So this one, consider a sentence, and this is another example from the book, or I have this in a footnote. Consider the sentence, we will have a picnic unless it rains. Right? So I'm going to need the truth table for alternation to explain to you why unless is sometimes a bad translation. So Q. Okay, so let's so we would translate this, we will have a picnic unless it rains, according to like official logic book rules, as putting in obvious letters P or R, right? And for some of the ways in which we use the word unless in ordinary language, this does work. But if you consider a sentence like we'll have a picnic unless it rains, well, when we say that, what are we saying exactly? If it's adequately captured by this, by our normal alternation operator, right, then it's true as long as one side or both sides is true. But that would make this sentence true if it really represents, or if it's really adequately represented as a logical alternation, right? That would make this whole sentence true if we have a picnic in the rain, right? Because look at this line of the truth table right here, right? So suppose that it's true that we have a picnic and it's true that it rains. That would mean that we said something true if we say that we'll have a picnic unless it rains. And that seems to be exactly what we're not saying when we say something like, we will have a picnic unless it rains. Right? What we're saying is, well, it's either going to rain or we're going to have a picnic, but both those things can't happen at the same time. Right? So for the purposes of this class, if you ever see an unless, I probably just won't give any to you if they're supposed to be translated like this. You might want to think to yourself, like, is that really what what the sentence is saying? Is it really an alternation? Right? If we wanted to translate this to what it actually means, we could do something like not P if and only if R, right? Because this will come out true as long as one of them is true but not both of them are true. I'm not going to do the full truth value analysis or whatever. But yeah, so aside from the fact that unless sometimes doesn't work, these are the only two ways in which you'll translate alternation. It's pretty straightforward. On to the biconditional. Okay, last thing we have to worry about, again, for P, just Quine ate a pie. Q, M for Quine drank a milkshake. Okay, so there are only two, I guess three sort of ways of representing the biconditional in ordinary English. So the first, with which you are already familiar, is P if and only if. That's awful writing. M, right? So if and only if is the way that I've been sort of translating it so far. And most times that's what you'll see, right? So the other way in which we represent the biconditional in ordinary English is with the phrase just in case. So if I said Quine ate a pie just in case he drank a milkshake, that's the other way in which we would translate the biconditional back into English. Right, so just memorize that just in case goes to the biconditional. Oh wait, I should probably write the biconditional arrow. Right. There is another one that will only ever crop up in a logic class, but if you ever hear me say something like P is logically equivalent to M, right, the phrase is logically equivalent to, as you learned in the previous module on implication and equivalence, we would also translate this with a biconditional arrow, right? Because equivalence is validity of the biconditional, right? And all that means is that when we say two things are logically equivalent, what we're saying is the same thing as the first thing's true if and only if the second thing's true, right? So yeah, that's how you translate. Another way of translating the biconditional. And those are pretty much all the ordinary English expressions that correspond to our operators. Sometimes if you're looking at very informal speech, they'll be implied, or there could be some different variations based on, context, colloquialisms, sentence structure, implied understanding, whatever. But at kind of macro level, for the purposes of this course, these are the only ones that you're going to see. So I'm just going to work through a few examples. It's important to note that there aren't precise rules for translating between schema in our language and ordinary English sentences or vice versa. So I can show you a few examples, and the ones that I'm going to give you aren't very difficult. But I can't give you, there do not exist and probably cannot exist, especially in a language like English that has a weird malleable grammar. We just can't have the sort of precise rules for translating back and forth that we would want. So if you can do the exercises in the chapter, I think you'll be fine. I think you'll do all right. However, if not, the best thing that I can do to help you is to try to give you some more examples. So if you're all still confused, after having looked at me try a handful of these, let me know, and I will throw up a video that just has more examples in it. But yeah, this is generally not that hard. I'm not trying to deceive you. I'm not going to give you super tricky translations on anything. I'm really only even covering this because I have to. Okay, so here's our first example. I made the sentence, if you don't eat a pie, then you won't be happy. But if you go to McDonald's, then you'll be satisfied and content. And here's all the translation letters are the obvious choices, I think, for that. Oops. So I'm just going to explain, actually I'm going to move that, how I go about doing this. And it's sort of the same thing that Quine tells you to do in the book, where you, what he calls paraphrase inward, right? So first, I'm just going to look at the sentence really close. So one of the things you have to be on the lookout for when you're translating longer sentences is grouping, right? So it's a good idea to try to figure out what the sentence as a whole is first, right? And one of the clues in English that we have a distinct set of groups is a comma. So see, we have this comma right here, and then it's followed by a but. So what that tells us, most of the time anyway, again, English is a weird language. It's kind of amazing that English works sometimes, is that everything that left that comma is going to be in one big group. and everything to the right of that comma is going to be in a different big group, right? And the sentence as a whole, because we have this but right after the comma, is a conjunction, right? So the structure of the sentence, right, it's going to be a conjunction in the middle. We don't know how many dots to put in yet, but that's all right. So let's look at the first group, that if you don't eat a pie, then you won't be happy, right? So we have P for you eat a pie. So if you don't eat a pie, that's a negation of you'll eat a pie. So not P, right? We see that there's an if and a then right there. And so we know it's a conditional. So it'll be if not P, then, so we have H here for you'll be happy. Obviously, you won't be happy is the negation of you'll be happy. So, we get if P, then not H, right? And again, we don't know the dots just yet, so I'm going to put in two kind of temporarily, right, to represent these dots will represent our conjunction, right? So what do we do next? Let me zoom in. So this whole second group, if you go to McDonald's, then you'll be happy, you'll be satisfied and content, right? So the whole thing's a conditional. And we have to use our judgment here as to how the grouping is going to work. So I think that the way that most people would think that this is grouped is, so we have the antecedent of the conditional is M. So you go to McDonald's, right? It's a conditional, so we have an arrow. And then we have the second part, then you'll be satisfied and content. So I think that the best translation of this is like this, right? Because this says that your being satisfied and content are both contingent upon your going to McDonald's, or they're conditioned upon your going to McDonald's or whatever. From a purely logical point of view, though, you could interpret the sentence as meaning this. So this would say, if you go to McDonald's, then you'll be satisfied, and regardless of whether or not you go to McDonald's, you'll be content. I think most people agree that's not what the sentence means. So this is how you would translate the first example. Or wait, no, I'm sorry. Like that. That's the good way to translate the first example. I'm never going to hold you to the like if you read that sentence and you really think it says that you'll be content regardless of whether or not you go to McDonald's, you're entitled to that reading of the sentence. You won't lose points for it. As long as you give me something that's unambiguous and matches up with the grammar of the English as far as it can, right? So the comma there means that, you know, that has to be the main operator. The whole thing has to be a conjunction. That's sort of non-negotiable. But the particular structure of this second clause here, you have some leeway with, right? Okay, so that's the first example. Let me conjure up another one real quick. Okay, second translation example. So we are working with the sentence, if you bake a cake but are lazy, then your cake will not be pretty unless you have good luck. With the translation key, the letter should be pretty obvious. So, zoom in for a second. So we have a comma here, right? We have an if here, and we have a then here. So what that tells us is, since we have our comma, right, comma followed by then with an if at the beginning of the sentence, tells us the whole thing is going to be a conditional. And this, whatever that amounts to, is going to be the antecedent, and this, which I'm underlining in purple, is going to be the consequent. Okay? So since we know the whole thing is going to be a conditional, we can just put the conditional arrow in, right? So the antecedent here, this you bake a cake but are lazy, well, we know that but's another way of translating and. So This is the conjunction of you bake a cake and you are lazy. So this would just be BL in the antecedent place of our conditional, right? So the consequent, right, is your cake will not be pretty unless you have good luck. So again, unless, despite my arguing against it for this translation, we are going to obey the book and translate unless into an alternation. So the consequent of our conditional is going to be an alternation. It's going to be the alternation of P. So your cake will, or not P, excuse me, for your cake will not be pretty. And the other component of the alternation is going to be G for you have good luck. And so this, as written, is ambiguous. So we need to put a dot here, or one dot actually works fine there. Right. If we really wanted to be fancy, we could do it like this, and it means the same thing. Check the dot notation supplement if you aren't clear as to why that means the same thing. Right. And so this is how we would translate this sentence. Okay. Gonna think up another example real quick. Okay, third example, and here we're looking at the sentence, you'll either fail the final, comma, or pass just in case you study hard, using another obvious translation key. So because we have this comma here and there's an or right by it, we know that the whole thing is going to be a alternation. The first component is you'll fail the final. I put the, I should maybe, sorry. Maybe a more grammatically appropriate way of writing this would be either you'll fail the final. That's a little clearer, right? So that's the first component. And the second component is you'll pass just in case you study hard. So again, we know that the main operator's an or, so we write our V there, right? So you'll fail the final. Well, F is you'll fail the final, right? And then there's going to be a group on this side, so just put the dot in right now. So you'll pass just in case you'll study hard is the right side component of the alternation. So remember, just in case is another way of saying if and only if, which we represent with a biconditional. So P for you'll pass, just in case, S for you'll study hard. And this is how we would translate that one. I'm going to do one more. Give me a minute to think of it. Okay, last example. Oh, wait, I forgot the key. P for you pass the class. B for you bomb the final. Okay, so here we're looking at the sentence, if you pass the class but bomb the final exam, then it's not the case that you'll pass the class only if you don't bomb the final. Okay, so let's try to break this down. So, where's the comma? Comma's right here, followed by then. The sentence starts with an if, and that's our clue that the sentence as a whole is a conditional, right? So the antecedent of that conditional, pick a different color. You pass the class but bomb the final exam, right? So that's just a conjunction. We know that but, again, the word but is a clue that we've got a conjunction going on. So the antecedent of our conditional is just the conjunction, P and B, right? So what might be confusing here is that the consequent of our conditional is, well, what is the consequent of our conditional, actually? So it's what comes after the then. It says it's not the case that you'll pass the class only if you don't bomb the final. So it might look to you like that's a conditional, and there is a conditional in there, but the main operator that governs all of the consequent of our schema as a whole, right, is actually negation. So we're going to need negation and parentheses. And so what do we have here? It's not the case that you'll pass the class only if you don't bomb the final. So remember, only if, scrolling up, conditional, right? Only if, right, if we have P only if Q, we would translate that the same way we would translate if P then Q, right? So, right, so we have, it's not the case that you'll pass the class only if you don't bomb the final, right? So the antecedent of that conditional is going to be P, and the consequent is going to be don't bomb the final, not B, right? Yeah. And that's how we would translate that one. So be careful for negation signs that govern whole groups. If you've listened to me try to say translations of the schemata as I'm writing them in previous videos, it's sort of hard to say something that clearly communicates that you're negating a whole group in English, right? So just be on the lookout for that. But again, I'm not going to try to trip you up, right? I'm going to try to make it pretty straightforward. And anyway, that's pretty much all you need to know about translation. Try the exercises. There aren't that many of them. Shouldn't take you very long. Yeah, those are the module videos for this week. Hopefully it's not too bad. I think this is a fairly easy week. Next week will be a little more difficult. Okay, cool. Catch you guys in a week.